Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's segment of Dentons Dialogue U.S. Policy Perspectives. We have a wonderful program in store for you today. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. Please note that today's webinar will be recorded and circulated to participants after the event. Additionally, should you have any questions that you'd like to submit to the panel, you may submit them through the chat box at the bottom of your screen. With that, I would now like to turn things over to Eric Tannenblatt, Dentons Global Chair of Public Policy and Regulation. Over to you, Eric.
Thank you, and welcome to our kickoff webinar of our Dentons Dialogue webinar series. Hope everyone has had an opportunity to review our 2021 policy scan that was released earlier in the week. And over the next 8 weeks, we're going to be hosting webinars that are going to go more in-depth into various policy issues. Today, we're going to have a broad federal overview. Next week, right after the inauguration, we're going to bring back our political panel and have a discussion about the state of politics in America. And that's going to be followed by in-depth webinars on COVID-19, climate and energy, healthcare, technology, smart cities and infrastructure, financial services, and housing. So at this time, it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to John Russell, a leader of our federal advocacy team in Washington, D.C., to facilitate today's discussion. So with that, John.
Great, thank you, Eric. Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us on a Friday afternoon. It goes without saying that the events of last week and the repercussions that we are continuing to feel both here in Washington and throughout the country weigh heavy on our hearts. But democracy's work continues, it doesn't stop. Today, we'd like to give you our thoughts on the new administration, the Congress, the priorities of governors and state houses around the country. We'll dive into some specific policy areas, but as Eric mentioned, I'd remind you that we will have much more in-depth policy-driven discussions the Friday at 3 o'clock for the coming weeks. We hope that you will join us for those, and we hope you will find them enjoyable. So keep your eyes on your inboxes for those invites. I'm joined today by colleagues from Dentons Public Policy team, and it's our intent to shed some light on the path forward here in Washington and, as I said, in state capitals around the country. I'd like to begin with our newest member of the team, someone we're very happy to welcome to Dentons, Brad Quasar. Brad, if you would, can you talk to us a little bit about the Biden administration and possibly where it differs from the Trump administration and what we should expect going forward?
Thank you, John, and welcome to everyone on the call this afternoon. For those as have not read the policy scan, please feel free to reach out to the firm. As a new member of the team, I read that last night. Very thorough, and obviously a number of subject matter experts have authored that, and it's a good outline for today's general overview. I think the initial reaction to a Biden administration in this particular case is change. That's not unique to the Biden administration, but clearly fairly normal for any administration coming into office. And then obviously we'll be talking about this, but taking over both chambers of Congress as well, that change will be magnified. I think before we get into what to expect in 2021, it'd be worth just a minute to talk about how we got there. And so I take us back to the campaign on the Democratic side. There were 24 official candidates running for office, a historical number for any party. And as most candidates for the nomination of the presidency, you want to be the man or the woman of all the people, and that's how you communicate your campaign. Most of these campaigns had very sophisticated campaign staffers and consultants, and they realized the only way to get out of that pack was to distinguish yourself. And so they were all forced to emerge as the labor candidate, the progressive candidate, the centrist candidate, the woman candidate, the diversity candidate, the tough on crime candidate, the one that had the most experience or lack of experience, the moderates. And it's very relevant in saying, and many of those candidates, by the way, fit into multiple buckets. But it's very relevant to talk about that because as President-elect Biden became the eventual and presumptive nominee and then the nominee, had smart people around him. You won the consolation prize by winning the nomination, but to be able to be elected in the general election, you had to build a much larger coalition of very distinct groups, associations around the country, let alone the campaign folks and the supporters of each of these individual 24 candidates. And so the relevancy of what to expect, I think, in 2021 is really based upon that, is the Biden administration, and I think they probably would have done that anyway, we're being forced, are forced into really building a very, very unique and diverse coalition to govern, to get things through Congress, to get rule changes, and to have the support of not only the Democratic Party in its broad coalitions, but the independents and the Republicans to move this country forward. The closest thing I can compare it to was what Obama called the gang of rivals. And from most practical standpoint, it was him hiring Hillary Clinton as his Secretary of State, which worked out very, very well. You've seen in this administration, the Biden administration, this president-elect, reach out to most of all of the presidential candidates, organizations, trade associations, labor organizations, to build a truly, truly diverse administration going forward. And again, the relevancy of that for 2021 is every single policy decision, I think, quite frankly, others will talk about this, legislative initiatives will be looked at that in that prism. So where broadband, you're going to be looking at broadband to be expanded into underserved communities in rural and urban. You'll be looking at COVID testing and vaccines going to underserved communities, and a number of the other initiatives, including infrastructure and the things that we'll talk about later in this call, all being looked at under the prism, very closely looked at with social justice, minority, and economic equity. The first 100 days. John and I talked about this a couple of days ago. Normally, any president coming in, the first 100 days is considered their honeymoon. I know that during the Obama administration, they had a crisis, and the Bush administration worked very closely with them to keep us off the brink of, quite frankly, a potential depression. That was one major disruptor that occurred in the first 100 days, and it was considered historical. This administration is inheriting, and again, we'll get into the issues, scores of issues that they are inheriting from day one and will not have the ability to prioritize any of these. So you can't pick something easy to pass through during your political honeymoon of the first 100 days. They will hit the ground running with at least 10 major initiatives that need to be addressed immediately. At the same time, the cabinet has been named. They have to go through confirmation hearings. Sub-cabinet people, some confirmed, some political appointees. You've got a number of the, quite frankly, in the first year of any administration, there are thousands of young men and women, and I say young men and women, it's traditionally the category, who have been waiting to join the administration and are going to enter in various roles in the bowels of the federal bureaucracy and the White House staff. All of that going on at the exact same time. Also what complicates it, I think, is the COVID. They are looking at protocols to determine, for those who have been in the White House or are aware of the White House structure, the staff are on top of each other. And I think that the Biden administration has made it very clear that they're going to respect sort of the CDC guidelines. So they're making decisions as who are essential employees that need to be in the federal agencies and in the White House staff on a day-to-day basis, and who is working, for, like many of us here on this call, from home. So that only complicates the transition in putting in the effectual policy changes and rulemaking changes going forward when you have a good number of the new people working from home, waiting for confirmation, and then figuratively and literally trying to figure out where the restroom is in the coffee pot, all at the same time with the urgency of 10 to 12 immediate issues. The good news, I think, and partly credited to Congress several years ago about passing legislation on the transition, where there's months of preparation and financial resources and office space provided. This, by many historians on TV pundits and others, has said this is one of the best run transitions despite getting a late start. For example, the transition team announced several weeks ago, they have solicited members of Congress for names for federal judicial vacancies and US attorney vacancies throughout the country, and those are due by January 17th. So I would have predicted by the time they got down to judicial and US attorney type positions, that would be far into the spring or early summer. They are clearly doing a great job. And so despite the obstacles that I just expressed, I think in 2021, we're going to be on hyper speed going forward. I think this provides, as any administration, Republican, Democrat, change is an important dynamic for our clients and for us here at the firm. It provides an excellent opportunity for new clients, business development, and marketing collectively for all of us at the firm and the clients that are on this call today. Sophisticated clients understand this and have engaged in either swap out teams and so forth, representing the distinctions between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. But there's somewhat less sophisticated clients out there that need to know and be aware that the train is moving out of the station. And if you're not on board, then you're going to miss out because things are going to be happening quicker than most of us can react to. So we look forward to working with you, and further guidance is in the policy scan document and the seminars and programs that are ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. I appreciate that. So Sandra, we're going to have an administration with 10 or so top priorities. We're going to have an administration full of people that have actually, shall we say, and I mean this not pejoratively, but with much love and respect, are swamp creatures. So they appreciate and understand the power that they have at their hands and also the limitations of that power. And it comes with the experience that these people have. How are they going to interact with Congress? What are we looking at for the legislative chamber coming up?
Well, John, thank you and welcome everyone. You're correct in following what Brad's remarks. This is a very seasoned White House full of folks who have worked both in the Clinton administration and the Obama administration. Lots of Capitol Hill experience. So I think there's, because of the pressing needs, I think the Vice President, President-elect Biden was wise to go with a team that's pretty much ready to go right away. If there are outsiders and newbies to come in the administration, they may come later, just because the pressing nature of COVID and the economic struggles are so intense that they'll want to tackle them right away. The Senate has been, is going to be very busy from the get-go here in the 117th Congress, both since most nomination hearings will not take place until the day before the inauguration or later. The Senate is going to be spending much of its time for the first 2 or 3 weeks confirming cabinet and sub-cabinet picks. Today, Speaker Pelosi would not give a timeline on when she would send the article of impeachment over to the Senate. Most people thought that that would happen on January 19th, but she wouldn't commit to that today. I think that Senator Schumer and the Democrats would appreciate it if that came later in the spring, so they would have time to tackle the nominations and a COVID package. On the COVID and economic package, I, being a Green Bay Packers fan, I'm going to go with a football analogy here. I think Joe Biden is going to be like the quarterback on 4th and goal on the 1 yard line, and he does a rollout, and he has an option to pass or run. And I think that's the way he is going to approach the COVID package. I think first he's going to try to negotiate something with the Republican leadership in the House and Senate, probably more focused on the Senate. I think he's going to give that great weight and be willing to be flexible. Assuming that fails, which probably I think the odds are of that failing, but you never know. Then option 2 is to go pass this legislation through what we call budget reconciliation. And the things you need to know about budget reconciliation are that that package cannot be filibustered. So it's a 50 vote margin in the US Senate to pass that. The package can only include budget related items. So let's think Medicare, Medicaid, tax cuts, tax increases, tax incentives, ag subsidies, nutrition support, student loan rates, interest rates, things like that. Things not to think about that can be included in that are the minimum wage increase that the president-elect is proposing, or voting rights legislation, or police reform, things that don't relate directly to the budget. And that also includes, not related to the budget, is the annual spending bills that we do every year, 12 spending bills for the Congress to fund all the annual operations of the federal government. A couple more things to realize about budget reconciliation is that while it applies to the House has the ability to waive rules, all the rules. And the big test of this package passing the Senate will be, are the items in there directly related to budget and taxes? And the House can waive this rule, and they can put things that aren't related to budget and taxes in there. But if that were to stay in the Senate bill, any senator has the right to challenge these non-budget items, and to challenge it, you would need 60 votes to override for each provision. Typically, the minority tries to strike all these, not so much that they disagree with them, but just on principle that this process should only include budget items. Sometimes the nature of these budget items are debatable about whether they really affect the budget. And one of the rules of budget reconciliation is the purpose of the provision has to affect the budget, not to do something else. So for instance, Congress passed last Congress law raising the tobacco purchase age to 21. That will have an effect on collection of revenue under this for the cigarette tax. There are fewer people buying cigarettes. But that's not the purpose of that. The purpose of that 21 age increase was not to affect the budget. It was a public health measure. So there'll be debates and fights and parliamentary skirmishes about this, but it's a fast track process, can't be filibustered. It is 2 stages. Congress first needs to pass what's called a budget resolution to govern its work internally, and then it needs to follow that up with real legislation. So give soon-to-be President Biden a month or month and a half to try to negotiate something, and if not, expect Congress to go that route and expect a likely very partisan process.
Thank you, Senator. So I'd like to move now to David Quam. David leads our 50-state strategy that gives us access into all 50 state capitals. And David, kind of ask you, as Sandra lays it out, we've got 6 weeks of negotiations with the Biden administration and leaders in Congress to try and move a package to possibly avoid reconciliation. But as they're doing that, what are we looking at in state chambers and governors' mansions this first quarter?
That's the perfect question. And as we wait for the federal government to move, the states, of course, have been calling on the federal government to help with the budget situation in all state capitals and, frankly, all major cities as well. There had been a call last year for over $350 billion in aid that was not passed by Congress, but it could be part of a new Biden proposal. But as they wait, it's worth noting exactly where the states stand. So for the 50 states, you've got budget projections for next year that are almost 11% below what they were supposed to be when pre-COVID. That's about $100 billion off for 2021, just existing budget holes. And that's even after all the CARES Act money and things that the states have received. States have drawn down nearly $33 billion from the rainy day funds. And so what all this means is that budget is going to be the number one issue across all 50 states. And because of the year we're in, state legislatures are back. Usually they're only in for half a year. A lot are temporary, but all legislatures are back in session. And so governors and legislatures are going to be really focused on COVID relief, their economies, vaccinations. That's really going to lead the charge for every single state, both in January and February. A couple of things to really keep an eye on. One, our governors are doing their state of the state addresses. Find out exactly what are the priorities for each state. That's going to be a key. Number two, those fiscal reports that are going to come out from the National Governors Association, National Conference of State Legislatures, are going to give us a real clear sign of whether the states are going to be either helpful with regard to recovery, or they could be a drag on recovery as we go into 2021. Now, for the states, we've talked to a lot of state legislatures and governors' offices, and again, they're focused on number one, budget. Number two, COVID response. But number three, they've got some real backups with regard to legislative activity within their states. This past year, even though it's been so focused on COVID, there's a lot of things that states still want to move forward on. One that we saw throughout our survey, and this is a bit related to COVID, is broadband and infrastructure. With everybody at home, with schools online, having real strong broadband and access, affordable access, both in urban centers and rural centers, is something that governors are focused on across the board. Now, interestingly, coming out of the elections last year, there is really not much of a political change at all among either governorships or state legislatures. As a matter of fact, Republicans picked up 100 seats nationwide in state legislatures. The blue states are bluer, the red states are redder. We only have one state that actually has a House and a Senate that are of different parties. Otherwise, for the most part, you have one party controlling every state legislature other than Minnesota. So we've got a active year where states are going to be hitting the ground running. They're going to be looking to see what the federal government does with regard to additional funds, but they're also going to be taking care of their own people. And one thing to remember, governors have really been at the forefront of this crisis for the last 9 months. As a matter of fact, governors have met with the administration as a group, and this is pretty rare, but all governors calling in more than 39 times in the last 9 months with the administration. When it comes to vaccine distribution, governors and states generally are the ones who really control how that happens in states. So it's going to be interesting as the Biden administration comes in, how they work together. Last thing I'll note is when President-elect Biden was vice president, he actually helped with the Recovery Act back in 2008. He's the one who made calls to governors on a weekly basis, met with all of them, making sure that money was spent well and quickly. I expect him to continue that type of relationship with governors and states as he seeks to really put together a 100-day plan. As he hits the ground running, he's going to look to governors to really be partners in that moving forward. So it's going to be a very interesting year. Everyone's got to pay attention to what's happening in state capitals. Thanks, John.
Thank you, David, and we appreciate you calling in from the mobile office. Clearly, the Dentons, we're anywhere you need to be, where there's Wi-Fi and leather seats and no dogs or children. I'd like now to take an opportunity to dig a little bit deeper into the policy section, and I'd remind those that are going to be presenting, we are on the clock, so let's try and keep it moving and keep it fast. Two of our previous speakers, actually all three of our previous speakers mentioned COVID. So Gary Goldberg, I'd like to kick it to you. We saw last night the Biden team put out the American Rescue Plan. Wonder if you could give us some high levels into what that is and where you think it goes from here.
Sure. Thanks, John. Good afternoon, everybody. Obviously, in a 5-minute presentation, we're not going to do justice to a $1.9 trillion plan, but I'll try to hit some of the highlights, and we can drill down as deep as you want to go into any of these provisions based upon the issues that are of interest to you and your colleagues. I think it's most important at the outset to follow up on what Sanders said in terms of the sequence here. If you saw President-elect Biden's speech last evening, he talked about his intention to offer the American Rescue Plan, and then in February to offer a separate plan that will include infrastructure and that will include other elements of his overall policy agenda. I view that as an effort to try to see whether or not he can make good on his efforts to pursue bipartisan solutions and attract some Republican support for his proposals, based upon the premise that you may have some Republicans who are prepared to support relief provisions, but have objections to the overall cost of the Biden proposals, and therefore splitting the proposals into two categories, I think is a good approach tactically. Now, in terms of the substance of the plan, basically what the president-elect announced last night was a plan that provides $350 billion, as David Quam indicated, for states and localities to support essential workers, reopen the schools and more, $170 billion for education, $160 billion for health initiatives, including initiatives to substantially expand testing and the purchase of supplies. Obviously, to get the schools up and running will require enormous expenditures in terms of making the schools fit for students to come to class in person, and given the social distancing requirements that will still exist, there's going to be a need for more space in temporary facilities in a lot of those schools. There's also an additional $1,400 in direct payments to individuals. That's the $2,000 payment, $600 of which was provided in the December COVID relief package that became law on the 27th of December. Now, Senator Manchin already got himself in some hot water with some of the Democrats by saying that he didn't think that provision was targeted enough, that he wanted to see that only people who really needed the money get the money. And therefore, I think what's clear is, given the narrow margins that exist in both the Senate and the House, that there's going to be a need to try to work out compromises. You're not going to see the American Rescue Plan at $1.9 trillion enacted as is. Rather, you're going to see certain aspects of it carved away, even if there's an opportunity to arrive at a bipartisan solution. For example, as Sandra indicated, highly unlikely that you would see an increase in the minimum wage to $15 an hour from the current level of $7.25 in a proposal that is intended to deal with relief in connection with the crisis. Now, there's also $35 billion in the proposal in grants to state, local governments to try to use that money to enhance small business initiatives. They believe the Biden administration believes that they can get a bang for their buck of 5 times that, or $175 billion in additional small business lending, as a result of those infusions into state and local governments. You've got you've also got $15 billion that will go into a grant program for directly for small businesses. So in addition to the small business provisions, the loan provisions, the healthcare provisions, you see there are also going to be some additional worker protection provisions. Employees would be directed to provide hazard pay to frontline essential workers, including back payments for 2020. The unemployment benefits are going to be partially restored. The $300 benefit weekly would be increased to $400, not the $600 level that existed before. And the proposal would fully fund work sharing and extended unemployment benefits in those states that choose to offer it. There would also be emergency paid leave program expanded for workers through September 30th. And that law had expired on December 31 of 2020. There would be 14 weeks of paid sick leave and family medical leave for pandemic related reasons, including the time required for vaccination. A whole slew of tax credits, including child care tax credits that are part of the Biden plan. And then in addition to there's also substantial sums of money for nutrition through the SNAP program, the Supplemental Nutrition Program, $1 billion in benefits for temporary assistance for needy families, which is something that's very important, particularly to the Democratic caucus. And then, as indicated, enormous amounts of money for healthcare, $50 billion for testing, $30 billion for a disaster relief fund to reimburse the states for their expenditures, an additional $10 billion to expand manufacturing domestically for pandemic supplies, $20 billion for the National Vaccination Program. Now, this afternoon, President-elect Biden is going to announce, if he hasn't already, a $1 billion public relations program to try to ensure that vaccines actually get into people's arms. And this will be a very extensive PR campaign to make sure that people are aware of the need to be vaccinated and to make sure that you don't find the sort of pipeline problems that have existed to date with respect to the vaccination programs. There's also $20 billion for veterans health care, $4 billion for substance abuse issues. And while there's $800 billion for domestic violence survivors, again, that's the type of a provision that consists of part of the Democratic Party wish list that probably would not make it into a final proposal if something were to be negotiated. So, as I say, that's an attempt to try to squeeze an awful lot of material into a brief period of time. Happy to drill down further as there are questions. The only other point I would mention is, and it's something that all of us in our practice like to say and that we fervently believe, when it comes to these sorts of issues, we like to say, you're either at the table or you're on the menu. And we believe that we have the sort of experience and background that will help get clients to the table and allow you to influence the way that these matters move forward. Only other observation I'll make, and then I'll pass it on, is when we put out 94 pages of our policy scan, which is quite an endeavor, you always worry that you're going to, particularly with the pace of developments nowadays, that you're going to find yourself outmoded by developments. And I'm pleased and proud to say that policy scan is good today as when it was released, and we believe it will continue to be a document that will be useful and informative for you. So again, thanks for the opportunity to present, and back to you, John.
Gary, thank you very much. We need Let's kick it on over to you, Andrew Shaw. Clearly, climate has been a hallmark of Joe Biden's campaign and some of the steps he's taken since getting elected. Can you give us, in 4 minutes, a good overview of what we're looking at?
Yeah, thanks, John. And thanks for everybody tuning in today on a Friday afternoon. Climate really has been at the forefront of President-elect Biden's plans for governing. I think it's notable that in his nomination speech at the Democratic National Convention, he mentioned climate with COVID, the economy, and racial injustice as one of the 4 historic challenges facing the U.S. And since he won election, he has moved forward in some pretty significant steps in trying to address climate change. He has appointed Gina McCarthy as the Domestic Policy Council advisor, who will be coordinating across the federal government steps to address climate change. He's also established the first ever special presidential envoy for climate change, former Secretary of State and former Democratic presidential nominee John Kerry. And I think these 2 picks just crystallize the whole of government approach that the Biden administration is going to take to climate change. It's not going to just be environmental regulations, though we will see EPA and other agencies move forward in replacing Trump-era deregulatory efforts on greenhouse gas emissions. But it's also going to be financial regulations. The Securities and Exchange Commission could look at new disclosure requirements for publicly traded companies, encouraging rural development through the USDA, and also using our foreign policy to promote renewable and clean energy, which is also a jobs opportunity for the U.S. Clearly, on day 1 of his administration, we will see President Biden have the U.S. rejoin the Paris Agreement. And I think we'll see through former Secretary of State John Kerry, climate change bilateral engagement, particularly here in North America with Canada, but throughout our other bilateral and multilateral engagements. In Congress, I'm optimistic. There was great progress at the end of the year, despite how divisive climate was during the campaign. We saw the first passage of major energy legislation since 2007, the Energy Policy Act, which hitched a ride on the end of the year COVID and omnibus bill. With that kind of bipartisan cooperation, there are opportunities. We'll talk more about infrastructure, but there's agreement on things like electric vehicles. John Barrasso and Tom Carper last Congress worked together on an infrastructure package that didn't get over the finish line, but included a $1 billion EV title. I think there's also areas of cooperation when we get to an infrastructure package on grid modernization, investments in transmission and renewable energy. Another priority of the Democratic Congress and for the Biden administration is providing some long-term certainty with respect to the tax code for clean energy. We saw some extensions at the end of the year for the wind production tax credit and investment tax credit, but we'll need more certainty to be able to get the capital moving where we need to for the renewable sector. And then lastly, and kind of taking this whole government approach, there's bipartisan discussions and cooperation on trying to make it easier for the ag community, for farmers to be able to access voluntary carbon markets. And that could be an area of movement in the coming months. So I know we'll be diving more into these issues in a separate webinar in a couple weeks. So I'll stop there and turn it back over to John.
Andrew, thank you. You said infrastructure so many times, I thought we were back in Infrastructure Week, but it does look like that will be a lot of that. So why don't I kick it over to you, Mr. Walden. Greg Walden, give us a little preview as to what we should expect in infrastructure policy moving ahead.
Certainly. Well, yes, it was the butt of many jokes because other administrations have said, we're going to build and we're going to build and we're going to build, and they've founded on how to pay for infrastructure improvements. Well, President-elect Biden has said $2 trillion, build back better. And you will include in that the traditional roads, bridges, and airports. And of course, with Joe Biden, you have Amtrak. Well, that's Amtrak's probably best friend in the in the White House. But you also know, we also know that water systems are not in the best shape, that the electric grid is susceptible perhaps to cybersecurity attacks, as well as just being old. And as everyone, several people have mentioned, a broadband will be an infrastructure. So infrastructure means a lot of things to a lot of people. And again, what Andrew said earlier resonates here too. Biden has paired infrastructure with climate change. So we'll see if any infrastructure package moves, and we expect it to move, it will have several climate related provisions. The charging stations for electronic vehicles, that's kind of a very easy thing. Some things are a lot more difficult, but also expect to see automated vehicles, drones, urban air mobility, advanced air mobility. There'll be provisions in the infrastructure bill that will relate to other things that maybe people are not thinking about. They'll be included in the conversation. And also would expect to see some incentives to get America traveling again. That may not resonate right now when we're still at the height of the pandemic, but at some point, we'll go back to traveling. And can Congress jumpstart the economy by jumpstarting transportation? So always, how do you pay for it? There's not been many profiles encouraged between the administration and Congress. You go first. No, you go first. Well, if President Biden goes first with, this is how we're going to pay for it, I think he'll get a lot of kudos from the industry stakeholders. The question is whether we'll get the same response on Congress, because the gas tax, for instance, has not been increased since 1993. A little bit on smart cities. Well, what does the federal government do with cities? Well, it provides money, grants, deductions, tax credits. Expect to see a major title in the infrastructure bill to advance smart cities. And finally, a comment on Pete Buttigieg, who will be the next Secretary of Transportation. He's a mayor. What will be, I think, key for the success of the Department of Transportation for the Biden administration to put in the deputy position and the assistant secretary positions, and in the modal administrations, people who have some experience with transportation at the federal level. And I also would think that when you look at transportation and infrastructure, Alejandro Mayorkas at DHS, at Homeland Security, DHS is going to play a big role in that package as well. Back to you, John.
Thank you, Greg. Certainly you wouldn't expect DHS necessarily to be deeply involved in an infrastructure package, but that is kind of the world we live in when you start thinking about the technology concerns in there. And thinking about tech, why don't I kick it down to Michael Droback. Can you give us a kind of a look ahead as to what we should be expecting in the technology world for the next year or so?
It'd be a pleasure. Thanks, John, and happy to be with everyone today. I would say that it's been a rocky time for the internet community, certainly, and for technology generally, just in the midst of growth, and certainly a time where the focus for the country and even the globe has been on how do we live in a global pandemic? How are we getting our community, our services, communications, and commerce? And it's largely been run through this digital economy and an app economy. So these are issues that are at the fore, and we have been addressing the cliche, which is the tech lash, which is largely a response to kind of a growing concern about whether or not some of these larger platform companies have received the appropriate oversight. So in a Biden administration, in a Biden-Harris administration, the general thinking is that we're moving towards more spending, more regulation, and more multilateralism. That is kind of, I know that sounds like I've summed it up very simply, and I think it is an oversimplification. But I would say, just starting off, and Greg and Andrew both referenced this, a $20 billion commitment to broadband deployment to cover those areas that are not covered is essential. The range of those that are uncovered today is between the 20 and 40 million Americans that don't have access to broadband service, which of course in these times makes things very difficult. That is going to be a primary focus, especially with underserved communities and minority communities and rural communities that have simply not been given the attention and the broadband exploration and expansion that is necessary. Secondarily, I think we're going to see a change, but not necessarily a complete deviation from the focus on antitrust and competition. So as most know, there are 3 lawsuits pending against Google, complaints that have been brought by the Department of Justice, as well as 2 in coordination with some of the states and the AGs, as well as 2 that have been brought against Facebook. The lawsuits range from on Google, their control of search and advertising, but amongst other claims and their control there. And on Facebook, it's their acquisition of both Instagram and WhatsApp and the communications terrain. So I think we'll see continued effort there, but I would not say we're going to see as vigorous an attention on those areas as we once saw, and certainly not from what we saw from the Trump administration. Moving on to the tone and the tenor of discussions on platforms, I think that we're going to see a strong push on the issue of are these platforms being responsible as it pertains to the speech and the content that is online and potential misinformation. There will be heavy focus on the Communications Decency Act and Section 230, which provides liability protection, but also provides the Good Samaritan provisions, which allows for content moderation by the platform. So there's a shield and a sword that Section 230 has provided platforms. I think that will certainly be at the fore of discussions. The problem, of course, that is a large discussion is whether this would hurt the larger platforms that it can avail themselves, certainly of attorneys and resources to defend themselves, whereas it could have any repeal of Section 230 could have an undue influence on startups and of innovation. And so there's a real focus there. The president-elect has indicated that he would be supportive of examining Section 230. And so I think content moderation and the larger platforms are going to be under the microscope with their activities. And certainly, as we've seen recently with lawsuits against Amazon by Parler and some of the dialogue around the current president's tweets and his messages and violence that we've seen, John, that you referenced at the outset of this call, I think we're all mindful of those things. I think it's also important for us to look at what I mentioned in terms of spending, and it's also taxation. So there is a great concern that when we look to the technology sphere, that there will be greater emphasis on will you tax digital services? And that has been at the fore in our global relationships, as we've seen efforts to tax digital services, as they called it, the GAFA tax, which referenced Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple. There have been, the current administration and the incoming administration may have very different approaches. The Trump administration went forward with Section 301 investigations and was prepared to be retaliatory with tariffs on foreign countries that were, as they believed it, disproportionately taxing or double taxing the gross income for U.S. companies. And I think that's going to continue to be an issue. There is a process at the OECD that many believe will not produce the results that will be advantageous for the U.S. But this comes at a time where a Biden-Harris administration is going to be balancing relationships with foreign countries and how we are repositioning ourselves as a leader amongst the globe. And so it's going to be, or within the globe, and that's going to be a very difficult issue on the digital services tax for a number of U.S. companies that are overseas. I think that's also true of e-privacy directive with the new Portuguese leadership of the EU, as well as Digital Markets Act. These are all issues that I think will be at the fore for the administration and how it approaches technology issues and internet issues globally. We'll also be looking at the gig economy. I think this is a prominent issue that's before certainly the country, which is, are gig workers going to be afforded the opportunities for collective bargaining? Are they going to be afforded opportunities to receive some form of benefits? Obviously, this has been fought out very publicly in California under the Dynamex decision and AB 5, and then of course Proposition 22, where Uber and Lyft exempted themselves from having their drivers being anything but contractors or independent contractors. And so I believe that this is an area where the Trump administration that moved forward with and published rules to provide greater flexibility. I think that the Biden-Harris administration will pull that back. I think there will be a re-examination of how do you classify workers. And then finally, I think there's going to be something that I think is an exciting opportunity for the country under this new administration, which is workforce and reskilling and retraining. And that is a re-examination of how technology can impact our ability to train workers, to look at the new jobs that have been created, and to have a much more cutting edge approach to reskilling. And there are companies and industries that are truly looking at the conventional way that we educate our workers and train them to new models that we are seeing. And I think there will be a push around infusing technology by this administration into how we live in a way that will advance the cause of workers and society. But we remain connected through a digital economy that has allowed us to do virtual school, allowed us to do distance learning and work, and allowed us to keep in touch with our communities and our families in a way that I think it has been necessary, certainly during these trying times. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate that. I'd like to change gears a little bit and go to you, Ashley Lawrence, to talk about what Michael was mentioning, reskilling. I'd like you to talk kind of about skilling, if you will, and education policy in the next year.
Sure, happy to be here. So it's our understanding that the Biden administration wants to invest in all children, regardless of their zip code, parents' income, race, disability, in general. So in order to do this, the Biden administration seeks to significantly increase spending across the education spectrum and address the student debt crisis. As we all heard last night, Biden is calling on Congress to provide $170 billion for the safety of reopening of our schools. The Biden administration will work with Congress to provide significant targeted federal funds to support the educational success of low-income students, students of color, and other marginalized students. So this means that enacting legislation to provide additional support for the educational opportunity students need during and following the COVID-19 public health crisis, with a focus on those students who were denied an equitable education before the current crisis began. I anticipate that the new Education Secretary, Miguel Cardona, will make a real effort to actually enforce our nation's civil rights laws and rebuild the Office of Civil Rights and make sure that they are investigating complaints. A Biden administration will include legislation to expand access to early childhood education, including Head Start, especially for children who are low income or from migrant families. Biden would triple Title I funding and require districts to use the funds to offer competitive salaries. Within the past year, there has been momentum to make significant reforms in higher education, including the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. And additionally, potential education legislation would attempt to make college more affordable by making four-year public universities debt-free for low-income college students.
Thank you, Ashley. I mean, it's an aggressive agenda on the education sideline, but it does seem to follow the general thread that we're seeing across Biden's domestic policy, and that is to reach out to communities that possibly have been overlooked over these last 4 years. Let's broaden our aperture a little bit, and if you will, move towards a international relations and foreign policy. Mr. Fetzer, if you wouldn't mind, what are we looking at for the next year?
Sure. Thanks very much, John, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. From a macro perspective, with the Biden administration, we will see a return to a more traditional process-based multilateral approach to U.S. defense and foreign policymaking. And this is underscored by President-elect Biden's selections of Tony Blinken to serve as Secretary of State and Jake Sullivan to serve as National Security Advisor. They are longtime friends, longtime collaborators. They share a worldview similar to President-elect Biden's, in that, at least within the Democratic Party ecosystem, I would argue that they are centrists. I think that's actually a fair assessment, regardless of party or affiliation or ideology. They have demonstrated support for intervention in the past on the basis of promotion of American democratic principles or to right perceived malign activities or wrongs. So we are not going to see, I believe, as stark a contrast from that perspective as some may believe. As the tie-in to Andrew's comments earlier, and this will be a very sharp contrast to the Trump administration. The Biden administration is very likely to focus on the nexus between climate, national security, and foreign policy in a way that the Trump administration never embraced. This is evidenced by the fact that Secretary Kerry, in his role as climate czar, will be a member of the National Security Council. Now, just to the micro level for a moment, because I do want to respond to a question we received in advance of today's webinar, John. The question was about the Biden administration's policy toward Iran, and specifically about the JCPOA, otherwise known as the Iran nuclear deal. All I will say is that the Biden administration, principally President-elect Biden himself, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, and Tony Blinken, among others, have emphasized that they do intend to engage with the Iranians in good faith to discuss a possible revitalization of the 2015 agreement. This will be rife with challenges and complications. This is based in large part on the fact that Iran is a different geopolitical threat and different geopolitical foe than it was in 2015. And the Biden administration players know and understand this. Whether preconditions on both sides of these discussions can be satisfied remains an open question. But there is no doubt that there will be a very different posture toward Iran with the Biden administration in place. Time will tell what probability exists for a return to that agreement in some form. In its original form, I believe is highly unlikely. Thanks, and over to you. I know we've got some time constraints.
We certainly do. And it speaks more to the fact of just how much is happening, what we expect here in the new year. We are 1 minute and 15 seconds, according to my watch, away from the top of the hour. We asked you for just 1 hour. So what we're going to do is actually chop off 3 issues that we wanted to give a little bit of a highlight on and direct you, if you're interested in cannabis, the PPP program, or healthcare and financial services, direct you to the policy scan. We do have a good overview on that in our document, but also invite you to join us on a issue specific webinar. Again, our calendars are 3 o'clock Eastern time on Fridays going into mid-March, where we will spend the hour on a specific issue. I want to thank you all for joining us today. I leave you with a simple plea. May we all enjoy the peaceful transfer of power on the 20th, and may we all join hands and work together as Americans on Monday. On Martin Luther King Day, can you please try your best to do something for someone other than yourself or your family? A little bit of service in the community could all do us very, very well. And with that, I wish you well. I wish you a very good weekend. Thank you for joining us. And we hope to see you back here again for one of our Friday sessions. Have a great day. Be safe.